So just to introduce myself then, I'm a chartered landscape architect. I joined HighWiz England in 2001. We were the HighWiz agency then, after a career in local authority landscape planning. And I'm now the head of environment in HighWiz England. And I suppose the question that might occur to you is, why is an environmental professional wanting to work for HighWiz England? What's that all about then? And I suppose if you think about what motivates a career or what drives you, for me, it's about trying to make a really big difference for the country in meeting our environmental challenges. And if you're going to ask that question, well, how do you do that? For me, the answer is, well, you go to the places that have the environmental challenges and you work within that system or within that organization to make a difference. Other people take a different view, but it works for me. And I think in my professional life, I've seen some really big challenges, and making a difference to those challenges, even to actually potentially quite a small degree, actually does pay quite big dividends. So to tell you a little bit more about HighWiz England, if you're not familiar with us, I think most people probably are. So we operate England's strategic road network, just England, not Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And we're a relatively small part of the total road network by length, but really quite a big part by the amount of traffic, by the amount of freight. In some ways, you might think of us as the network of last resort. Certainly that seems to be how it works when we have key events such as the Boxing Day flooding many years ago, when sections of the rail network were heavily compromised. Actually, it was the strategic road network that kept the country just about moving. And it's actually really important. It's a network that people do rely on in their daily lives. And for us as a company, it's important to look after those road users and get freight to the places it needs to be. But we absolutely recognize actually there are other forms of transport, and we actually need the right use of transport for a particular purpose. I'm conscious that actually some of the presentations today may overlap in terms of their content. Actually, you may want to compare and contrast. That might be the right way of putting it. Seeing what you think, form a view. What I would like to talk about is climate change mitigation, HighWiz England's view of its carbon footprint. And I then want to follow that section by looking at biodiversity, which maybe other people aren't talking about so much today. So to just put this into context, I'll get all these up. And you may well have heard some of this stuff already. So climate change is happening. There is no avoiding a changing climate. And that has consequences for us and the life we live in this country. So, drier, hotter summers, wetter winters, more extreme events. And we have commitments as a country that we have signed up to. The Paris Agreement, of course, but we also have an act now to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. And I think the date by which what that suitable target should be, whether 2050 is soon enough, is an ongoing debate. And other organizations, other countries have taken different views. But what does that mean for transport? So clearly all forms of transport have a carbon footprint. This diagram illustrates where transport sits relatively recently in terms of carbon emissions for the country. And you'll see that actually transport is quite a significant proportion of that, just over a quarter. Actually, the more interesting point I want to make here, though, is the scale of change in emissions over recent decades. Since 1990, the proportion that comes from energy supply has reduced by about 60%. And the proportion from waste management has reduced by about 69%. the proportion from transport is only reduced by 2%. So we are behind the curve here in actually making a difference. So what forms that transport component of that footprint? Hopefully you can see that actually. So you'll see that actually road vehicles, we've got cars in red, vans in blue, HGVs in green, make up a really large majority of that footprint. And that's a real challenge for us. And I know the previous presentation, there was a really interesting discussion on what that challenge actually means. In terms of vehicle use on the SRN, 28.8 million tonnes, for using 2014 figures, comes from vehicles on the SRN. So that's roughly we're a quarter of that. So a quarter of transport emissions are from Highways England Strategic Road Network. So how are we responding to that challenge? We are increasing charging infrastructure around our network. Within our current funding roads period from government, we have a target to achieve 95% of the network within 20 miles of a charging point. And we're on target to achieve that by the end of this financial year. We're integrating cycle routes into highways design and indeed thinking more about and building it into design, integrated transport interchange. Because actually our network is a component of a wider transport network. Very few people make journeys purely on our network. They're normally integrated with local road networks, going to an airport, going to a train station, or using local roads. We are doing substantial research into particularly HGVs and haulage because it's a particularly challenging area to reduce carbon emissions. We're working with government on zero-emission HGV technology trials, and we're also looking at platooning vehicles that also show evidence of reducing emissions per vehicle when they are platooned. We're trialling use of electric vehicles ourselves in our own operations. And in addition to that, we're also working with local authorities on electric van centres of excellence. This is a means of allowing local businesses to actually test electric vans, use them within their own fleets, their own delivery systems, and by that experience of using those electric vehicles, overcoming the problems that they have. And then when they make their own purchase decisions as to what their future fleet looks like, they already understand actually how to operate those vehicles within their fleet. And it makes that decision for them easier. And picking up an earlier point, accounting for carbon in appraisal of schemes fully. Clearly, that's only the start of a, to use an overused phrase, a journey. We have to do things differently and with more ambition. We need to influence driving behaviour. Can we encourage people to share cars, use that empty space in vehicles? Think more intelligently about the journeys they make. Are they actually using the best form of transport for the journey they need to make? So take public transport, actually avoid a journey, use Skype or whatever, and actually drive more efficiently, not be extravagant with the use of their vehicle just because it happens to be standing outside their front door. Supporting new technologies. Clearly, low-emission vehicles are a small proportion of the fleet at the moment. We are going to have to think about how our infrastructure supports that new type of technology. And for things like HGVs and autonomous vehicles that are, or low-emission HGVs and autonomous vehicles, which are potentially very different sorts of technologies for our network, providing the infrastructure that supports them using our network will be really interesting. There are trials overseas, for example, using catenary systems, so for HGVs, essentially making HGVs like a tram system on the network. That would require huge investment for us to adopt, but it's something that we are looking at. The leading by example point is actually really critical. For a company like Highways England, we're a government-owned company. We operate a really key part of national infrastructure. If we take a stand on an issue, or if we demonstrate by example what good looks like, then it can influence others. And that's something that we have to work with government on, clearly. But we recognize the power that our voice potentially has, and we will increasingly be using our voice to influence. Working in partnership, of course, as well. We don't do this by ourselves. There's a wider industry, there's a vehicle manufacturing industry, there's a freight haulage industry, there's a whole environmental stakeholder cohort out there. And all of those organizations need to be part of a wider understanding and effort towards reducing a carbon footprint. But carbon doesn't just come from the tailpipe of a vehicle. Carbon comes from construction as well. So construction is a relatively small proportion of total carbon from the operation of Highways England's network. The vast majority of the carbon footprint is from vehicles. But nevertheless, construction is not insignificant. So it comes from things like fuels to deliver sort of remote lighting, embedded carbon in materials used, how we handle waste, how we transport materials to site. And in terms of sort of what that looks like in terms of annual footprint, it's around, between a quarter and a third of 1,000 tonnes of carbon equivalent per year. So it is significant. And so breaking that down a little bit into actually material use, we can be, we need to be very mindful of actually how much carbon is embedded in the materials that we use in construction, because it's not necessarily obvious. In the middle there, you've got Portland cement, where in essence, for every kilogram of Portland cement you produce, you've got about a kilogram of carbon being produced. Aluminium, who knew? It's up there that nearly 7 times as much per kilogram of carbon is produced for every kilogram of aluminium produced. So that kind of information actually is really important for the future of managing construction. That diagram at the bottom comes from the Treasury. And what it essentially is saying is that you make the maximum reduction in carbon from your construction activities by thinking early about how you're actually going to deal with this issue. Do you even need to build this bit of infrastructure at all? Can we make more intelligent use of the infrastructure we've got? Is there really a business case for this construction? However, if you've then found that actually there is a real necessary driver, there is a real need for that construction, then try and minimize what you do. Build it more sensibly, with more innovation to reduce carbon, using materials with lower embodied carbon, and then just try and be as efficient as possible and deliver a good quality scheme. But you can absolutely see that actually fundamental decisions right at the start of the process, going back to that appraisal point that a previous speaker made, making the right decisions so that we only build what is really necessary. So that's essentially the carbon story for Highways England as an overview. It's not just about the tailpipe, it's also about construction. I want to now move on to biodiversity. Biodiversity, basically, the variety of life, species and habitats within the UK. Biodiversity has been on a downward trajectory for a very long time, despite lots of initiatives, lots of legislation, lots of policy programs. Biodiversity, nevertheless, has still continued to decline. That's something we have to address. I'm slightly hampered here because people may have noticed there's an election around the corner, so what I can't talk about is government policy. So sorry about that. But I think any future government is going to be mindful of the need that actually we need to reverse this downward trend of biodiversity. And there is a strong drive towards achieving biodiversity net gain. That essentially means that actually as a result of our activities, the activities of an organisation like Highways England, biodiversity is enhanced rather than reduced as a result of our activity. Traditionally, when we've built schemes, we do environmental impact assessment, we identify the impacts of a project, we seek to mitigate those as much as possible, or compensate for those adverse impacts. All well and good. So, we understand that there might be habitat severance, and we put in things like green bridges or underpasses to enable those habitats to remain connected. But the cumulative total, historically, is that across a construction program, there are still adverse environmental impacts residual from that work. We need to change that. We need to go from minimizing impacts, because ultimately there will still be that residual adverse, that continuing negative trend, to delivering an improved environment. And that will mean investment. We will have to have projects that invest in achieving positive environmental impacts, and biodiversity here particularly. That has to start from the beginning of a project, has to be from inception, and then it being a standard part of decision-making through all those key decisions, route alignment, do we tuck in close to that piece of woodland, or do we actually give it a bit more space to enable that habitat to be more effective and to be healthier, for example. And finally, to make a really key point, and this may seem minor, but having transparency on biodiversity performance, having it visible what the consequences are of those decisions that are being made is really key. Because if it's visible, if it's accounted for, if there's a metric that measures what's happening, then actually people pay attention, they notice it, and that drives decision-making. It drives corporate behaviours as well. Senior colleagues, boards of directors really do not like expectations and targets being missed. If you have a metric that illustrates this stuff, then people will pay attention. There are some issues with this, though, of course. It's not just a question of throwing money at the problem. Let's invest lots and lots of money in biodiversity and we'll get a good outcome. Because, of course, projects and schemes have to be financially viable across the piece. So you have to balance those environmental outcomes with ensuring that actually a project still delivers value for money for the taxpayer. As an environmental professional, it's potentially quite a painful thing to say. I would really like to see lots of investment in environment, but within the context of a road operator, that has to make business sense, and a road operator that's funded by a taxpayer has to make sense for the taxpayer as well. Again, picking up on a previous presentation, the key question there is: are the environmental negative outcomes of a project, or the positive outcomes of a project, are they being properly valued in the appraisal process when decisions are being made? Okay, so that design process to avoid biodiversity loss is fine, but we then, and that's actually the most important thing about this process, is you have to seek to avoid loss. And then you have to then think, okay, well, how do we then achieve betterment? Offsetting, if people aren't familiar with that term, that is about recognizing a negative biodiversity outcome on a scheme and investing in improvements elsewhere in order to achieve overall benefits from the investment. Again, we can't do this alone. We have to work with external organisations. Highways England, over recent years, has been working closely with organisations like the Canal and Rivers Trust, national parks, wildlife trusts, to actually use their expertise to ensure that when we invest, we're getting the best experience to ensure that investment gives the best value for biodiversity. Finally, there's a little bit of innovation here as well. We need to be creative about looking at where the opportunities for enhancement are. Aerial imagery, remote sensing enables us to be efficient at identifying enhancement opportunities and working out where we can target investment to deliver benefits. And as an approach on biodiversity, actually that's not where the story stops. This is an approach that we can extend out to across environment topics, whether it's about water quality, whether it's about noise, air pollution, carbon emissions, carbon reduction, soil management, cultural heritage, archaeology. Actually, all of these things provide benefits to society, and managing those on a net gain basis so that we actually get a better outcome as a result of our work for the environment rather than continued decline. Thank you very much.
These are all fantastic things that we do need to address. I think I'm a Gen X rather than anything else, so I like to think I've got the best of both worlds, but who pays for it? Clients are driving us to be more efficient, are driving us to come up with, innovative ideas to address issues like climate change, but they're also driving down prices. So where is the funding coming from for innovative ideas for tackling climate change?
Okay, I can answer that to some degree. In the last roads period, so 2015 to 2020, that's a funding period for Highways England from government. For the first time, there was ring-fenced funding for environmental improvement, and it was relatively sizable. The designated fund for environmental enhancement was £300 million over that 6-year period for the £300 million. So from a funding decision point of view, government decided that was in the taxpayer's interest. There was additional money provided for air quality improvement as well. I think the wider point, though, is actually where is society's interest here? What does society want out of this? If society values environment, if society values carbon reductions, then government would be mindful of that. And I think that's probably as much as I can say there.
I was going to say, I think we've got time for one more question. To what extent are lessons learnt and evidence of innovation from the post-opening project appraisal and evaluation schemes incorporated into future schemes?
Yeah, post-opening project appraisal, otherwise known as POAP, is a standard process in Highways England's work. And I think it's fair to say that as each scheme and as each activity has its post-opening appraisal, they're normally done at 1 year after and 5 years after for major schemes. We do learn from those. Sometimes the lessons take longer to learn than we might ideally like. One of the things that we are very conscious of course, is that our projects take essentially quite a long time to plan. They're in government's thought process for quite a long time before they come to High-Res England. They are then developed for quite a long time within High-Res England before the construction programme, and then into operation and long-term operation, and things have a huge operational life after that. So the work pipeline we have doesn't respond quickly to short-term policy changes. So, for example, a future government might make a policy view about environmental performance from High-Res England after the election, but actually there's a big pipeline of work already underway, and unless the government chooses to change what that pipeline of work looks like, it'll take quite a long time for those policy changes to feed into our programs.